Good Thursday to everyone. Welcome. Welcome to One Spirit's gathering for tonight, for the 8th of April. It's the 51st such evening I found out that One Spirit has done, starting with the time of COVID and continuing on through where we are now as we shift and change in that experience. If you can, just take a look across the gallery view for everyone who is here tonight. Some people you'll know, some people you won't. They're all beloveds, even those that you don't yet know. So I send you greetings and welcome, and let's begin. Yom HaShoah, the Day of Holocaust Remembrance. This year, today in the Gregorian calendar, the 8th of April, it is also the 27th day of Nisan in the Jewish calendar. It's the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in 1943, and it commemorates this time, these experiences between 1938 and 1945, a count of somewhere around 6 million Jews were murdered. Today's the day to remember this. In Israel, on the morning of this day, a siren blasts for 2 minutes, 2 minutes. There, I understand that all activity ceases. People stop in the streets. Cars stop on the motorways. So we are going to begin this evening with our 2 minutes of remembrance of this. I'm not going to play a siren, but there will be music. And to help you remember, let your eyes close or soften. And remember. 2 minutes. When I began planning for this time that we're together tonight, I was certainly aware of this being the Thursday following Passover and following Easter, and the Thursday before the start of Ramadan. So these feasts celebrating respectively liberation and rebirth and heightened devotion, there's certainly enough for us to consider tonight. We can ask ourselves, from what do we each desire freedom? And do these extraordinary times call us each and all to some rebirth? How might we work through our routines to new levels of devotion to the divine? And all these would have been good questions, soundly religious in the settings that we have, right? And spiritual milestones that we could be called to think about. And I was going off in that direction when suddenly something in the back of my awareness said, you want to look at your calendar. And I did, and Google had already noted that on this day, we were celebrating Yom HaShoah. So I thought I need to shift somewhat and remember this remembrance. I was talking to a modern, he calls himself a modern Orthodox scholar and friend of mine, and he said, as long as survivors live, Israel will remember this Holocaust. And so here we are remembering this today. He also said, we Orthodox, we have a lot of other disasters that we remember. And that led me to the reflection that I'm inviting you to tonight. The many things that we remember personally and collectively, the stories we tell about events and what the events tell us about ourselves. So let's begin first with Shoah. It translates roughly to whirlwind. And our dictionaries define whirlwind as, the typical column of air moving rapidly around and around in a cylindrical or a funnel shape. It says whirlwind is used as a metaphor for something or someone very energetic. You can think toddlers sometimes being called whirlwinds of activity, right? And there's anything else that resembles a whirlwind, usually noted in violent or destructive action. As I was thinking about it, a whirlwind is like, it's a catastrophe, right? Something that totally overturns what was there. When I was defining that, I had images of cyclones and hurricanes and tornadoes right in mind. And with that, it's really easy for me to think about registering the disastrous outcomes of whirlwinds. So Shoah, as a whirlwind, instantly brings up the idea of a disaster. Back to that little kid who has the aspect of a too muchness, and they call him a whirlwind, that lurking suspicion that there's something wrong more than something right in being that little Tasmanian whirlwind, that little devil. Disasters. That's what they are, disasters. It means literally being under a bad star. Bad, aster, star. Being under a bad star. And disasters plague us. We have a call to other deities that say, help me from this, right? In some cultures, there were sacrifices to sky gods, to gods in the heavens, to the stars, to say, make this right because you've somehow gotten out of alignment. So thinking about that and then returning to the time of the Holocaust, while we center here the lives of more than 50% of European Jewry that was taken in ways that range from, deliberate medical experimentation to starvation to overwork to being shot and hanged, gassed, and all those things, it is so true that many were ravaged by the bad star. And the Holocaust was not only the horror of what we have come to call this time period from the Second World War, but the Second World War itself. In total, more than 75 million people, including the Jews of the Holocaust, died from that war. Direct causes, state-sponsored killing, or the famine or anything else that was caused by the war. The war was a whirlwind. It overturned lives on all continents other than Antarctica. Millions of lives in India, in China, and the then Soviet Union were all taken in this Shoah. It's interesting. I came upon another thing that I found as people are trying to understand the power that turns things upside down. There is a god called Huracan. Sounds like hurricane, right? It's where we took the word. Huracan. It's an indigenous Taino word from the Caribbean. It's morphed into that word hurricane. There are so many other whirlwinds that we've experienced, and I just want us to bring some of those to mind. Look at those. In addition to this one that we're talking about, you can read the others that just came to my mind in our sort of known and held history. There are wars, there are slaughters, there are individual people who've come to disaster, who've gotten caught up in whirlwinds of hate, of racism, of things like Fukushima, which was a happening that the earth created that impacted something that we created and morphed into something we could not have imagined, laying waste to much of the northern Pacific, where for years starfish and shellfish did not live. And then we have things like Love Canal, and if you're old enough to remember Bhopal in India, and Flint, things where we poison ourselves. And you can see the rest of it. Viruses, tsunamis, the result of climate disruptions, and then human tsunamis of evictions and hunger, despair, suicide, and the rest of it. Think about those disasters that we share, that we run into. From the Buddhist teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh, he provides another lens on the whirlwind. Listen to what he says about these disasters, part of a poem that you've probably heard before. He writes, I am the frog swimming happily in the clear water of a pond, and I am the grass snake that silently feeds itself on the frog. I am the child in Uganda, all skin and bones, my legs as thin as bamboo sticks. And I am the arms merchant selling deadly weapons to Uganda. I'm the 12-year-old girl refugee on a small boat who throws herself into the ocean after being raped by a sea pirate. And I am the sea pirate, my heart not yet capable of seeing, loving. Breathe. Breathe, my friends, because holding whirlwinds is hard. Take a moment now with me, if you will, to take these situations of Shoah, of catastrophe, of disaster, of living under some bad star. Take them in while you breathe. Settle yourself for a moment, letting these disasters come toward you, not so as to overwhelm you or overwhelm your imagination or your emotions, but so you can hold it. Hold that as I read an excerpt from The Invitation by a mountain dreamer. She writes, "It doesn't interest me what planets are squaring your moon. I want to know if you have touched the center of your own sorrow, if you have been opened by life's betrayals or have become shriveled and closed from fear of further pain. I want to know if you can sit with pain, mine or your own, without moving to hide it or fade it or fix it." My dear friends, this evening here, what of your life? What of your life? What have your whirlwinds been? As you hear that invitation to sit with pain, yours or another's, and as you sit with these recent historical whirlwinds that were on screen, these disasters, I ask you if you would take a moment, maybe with a piece of paper if you go on to grab one, or on the top of your laptop, so that you can note where in your body you might be holding the memory of your own disasters. There'll be a little bit of time, maybe 3 or 4 minutes, to check in with yourself, to sink into your awareness. And when you have, maybe just jot some notes about where in your body you notice, or where you notice numbness or a hole, as you bring to mind those whirlwinds that you know. And take a minute more and just jot the rest of this down. And if it seems useful to you, place your hand or your consciousness where your body has shown you that you may have been holding any memory. Maybe it's in your head, or maybe in your heart, maybe on your knee, where you seem to hold memory of pain or disaster in your body. And again, just take a moment or two with your awareness, with your hand on that place. See what's there. And if you'd like, take a moment or two to write that down. What that memory is. What story or meaning comes from the place where the memory has been held. We'll be in silence for a minute or two. So now, as we have brought a little awareness to our memory of our own whirlwinds, to our own Shoahs, sometimes they can seem endless. And as those who are ministering in whatever capacity to the needs of this world, sometimes our own woes and those of others can push us to shutting down, to numbness, even to flights of spiritual bypass where we think we've got it all together now. Maybe I'm speaking only for myself. Where we choose not to dwell on difficulties, but we rise our sights to the larger purpose of all of this. In some cases, we find that when we think of others and how they respond to catastrophe, we've told ourselves that some people are pushed to meanness. There's a strain of dystopian violence, sometimes in some editions of media or fictional works, if you think of A Clockwork Orange, or Blade Runner, or more recently, The Road. That what happens to some people, we think, when bad things happen is that bad things continue to happen. If we can't sit with our own pain or another's pain, what do we become? As I was reflecting, I thought sometimes, the media, their story is that we actually do move into these dystopian, violent, ugly images. In the past year, there are reactions to the pandemic that discount the reality of the virus, that minimize the destruction, that dismiss suffering. And often, at times, we're encouraged, not to dwell on the bad, right? Don't dwell on the past. You don't have to bring that to mind. We don't have to remember it. We don't want to look at what's hard because, nothing good can come of that. Today, on this day, it is a time to remember. So in remembering, in dwelling with the past, we find that maybe we need to live with disaster. I realized that the image of that funnel, of that cyclone, of that whirlwind, it can literally be turned on its ear. The funnel shape of the whirlwind, what I'm calling, its vertical representation, it can be shifted and we can see something different. Something like this. See the spiral arms, they're still there. And you see the eye now. That's its still point, right? We talk about the eye of the storm, the calm center around which the winds extend. We even say that the winds rage around. But that center, that still point, like a rock, if you will, that is not engaged in all of what's going on around it. So I let myself continue to move my lens from this vertical thing to when I tipped it, I got this eye of the storm. And as I allowed myself to see it, I was imagining that there might be even more complexity to the funnel. Now the spiral, and now what? Extending that to this collection of personal and collective disasters, what to make of them? So, as you see, I found myself wondering more about the various ways of viewing this whirlwind and about telling the stories of my own vertical disastrous funnels, and then tipping that over and noticing that there was some inviting complexity to the spiral. I know that many have come to this aha before me. This is not unique. But this shift in my way of speaking about what has been endured, about what has happened to me and to all of us, yet here I am, turning my perspective over and finding that the old story and the version of my woes and our woes can change. I found my old friend, the poet Gibran, speaking about what seems really like always new for me, as he said, as he wrote, "Then a woman said, 'Speak to us of joy and sorrow.' And he answered, 'Your joy is your sorrow unmasked, and the self-same well from which your laughter arises was oftentimes that well filled with your tears. And how else can it be? The deeper sorrow carves into your being, the more joy you can contain. Right? We need to remember that the deeper that sorrow carves into our being, the more joy we can contain. Is not the cup that holds your wine the very cup, the very one that was burned in the potter's oven? And isn't the lute that soothes your spirit the very wood that was hollowed out by knives? When you're joyous, look deep into your heart, and you shall find that it is only that which has given you sorrow that is giving you joy. When you're sorrowful, look again into your heart, and you shall see that in truth, you're weeping for that which has been your delight. Some of you say, joy is greater than sorrow. And others say, nay, sorrow is greater. But I say to you, they are inseparable. Together they come. And when one sits alone with you at your board, eating with you, remember, the other is asleep in your bed. So, not wanting to wash over our suffering and not be able to separate sorrow from joy, how our stories can change, how the vision can shift, brought me to remember an interview that Krista Tippett conducted a few years ago that I'd love to share a piece with you. It was rebroadcast. It was originally done about 4 years ago and was rebroadcast last year. And it's with Rebecca Solnit, who's a writer for a number of publications, as well as an author of her own collection of essays. Their conversation focused on what Solnit was reflecting about in the 1989 earthquake in San Francisco Bay Area, and then also about Katrina. Both occasions, as they pointed out, of the earth presenting humans with what we saw as devastation. And they spoke about how these events were held by the media especially, and the media being such a shaper of how we hold our stories now together. Solnit presented this narrative about Dorothy Day. You know, she was the founder of the Catholic Worker Organization. And the narrative goes something like this. I'm going to leave out a lot of it, but hopefully get the point of it. That one day in 1906, which is another earthquake time for San Francisco, Dorothy Day was living in Oakland across the bay, and she was 8 at the time. And she, in her very precocious 8-year-old way, she saw the wreckage of San Francisco and the rest of the Bay Area, but San Francisco was the largest of the towns at that time. And there were 3,000 people who died in that earthquake. Massive explosions, fires. She saw, as a child, years of rebuilding of that city. And she realized, yes, people fall apart in disasters. But she also realized that in disaster, there's this falling together, she said, that we don't often chronicle. We experience it, but we don't often have that as the main storyline. She saw that people were capable of this falling together, of coming together, of doing amazing things for one another, and that they were capable of this all along. They knew how to do this, right? And she asked, why can't we live this way all the time? that was her formative experience. She said that while disaster lasted, she saw that people loved one another. Isn't that interesting? For her, the earthquake becomes not only something that trembles underneath you, but it became a spiritual awakening and the template for what she pursued in her life. Those people, especially in New York, who experienced so much of what happened in September 11th, 2001, know some of what this is like. I've heard you speak of it. And then Solnit moves on to talk about Katrina and about how the mainstream media seemed to be pushing a line of misinformation about what was going on. That they talked about that we all, and then they especially underlined poor people, especially non-white people, who in dire circumstances, they said, revert to our savage nature. They talked about the fact that there was a massacre inside the Superdome. They talked enough about it in the mainstream media that the feds sent in temporary morgues and thousands of body bags. In reality, there were 6 needless deaths in the Superdome. And in reality, there were more than 200,000 people who invited strangers displaced by the ravages of that storm. They asked them into their homes through an organization called Hurricane Housing, which most of us never heard of. Thousands of people went to Louisiana to rebuild houses. And Solnit writes that these 2 competing narratives, one of complete annihilation of property and the human spirit, against the other one that says that situations happen and people rise up and offer help to whomever needs it, these 2 narratives were in competition. The worse the situation, she writes, the more we seem to converge and connect. But that isn't always the popular story. So it's important to say these whirlwinds in our lives, the more public ones and the less public ones, what's the story that we tell? So I wonder, is it destruction or creation in these stories, in this cauldron that we have of whirlwind and destruction? So I invite you to return to the idea of the whirlwind that you journaled about a little earlier, that you thought about. And with me, can you be curious about the other story that might be embedded in the situation that you remembered? And if you can be curious about that, what might that be? So just take a moment. Maybe we're going to do 2 or 3 minutes. And we'll bring to mind what other possibilities there might be in the whirlwinds that you have experienced. Not to be a Pollyanna, but just to note the other side. hopefully there will be more, the way of possibilities that come to all of us when we think about what are the other stories as we remember things. And I return to the ending of that same Thich Nhat Hanh poem, where he says to us, "My joy is like spring, so warm it makes flowers bloom all over the earth. My pain is like a river of tears, so vast it fills the four oceans. Please call me by my true names, so that I can hear all my cries and laughter at once, so that I can see my joy and pain are one. Please call me by my true names, so I can wake up, and so the door of my heart can be left open, the door of compassion. Please call me by my true names: destruction, creation, so I can wake up, and so the door of my heart can be left open. That's the door of compassion." So I found myself saying, well, might compassion and connection and concern, awakened consciousness, can that also be an outcome of this vortex of the whirlwind? Not only fear and violence and disconnection come out of there, but something else. We began the evening in remembering the Shoah, the loss of lives through unspeakably brutal genocidal acts. And we all know of many other instances of evil. We all have our own narratives of pain. And together tonight, we've taken a few moments to consider that we might turn the lens, shift our perspectives, and be willing to uncover and listen to other stories. One that is like the Passover liberation, or the Easter rebirth, or the Ramadan devotion. Let's remember, if we can, to stay awake to the depths of what we experience. And if we are in friendship with others, to help them stay awake to the depths of experience of what occurs in our lives and of the ongoing unfolding that we share together. So I ask that we remember. And before we go tonight, I'd like to unmute us all and to ask if there's anything that any of you want to share, have as remembrance, or are holding as a different lens. So please, if you will, return to the room. If you've stopped your video, come back in. And if there's anyone who would like to speak, please unmute. Patricia.
Hi.
Hi.
I don't know that I have a lot to say, except that during all of this, I just have the awareness that I've just been holding a lot, and I think the awareness of how much I've been holding, I really felt it in my shoulders. So it was an opportunity to just be aware of it.
Yeah, thank you.
you.
Thank you. Maybe they want a little attention. from you.
I'll share that I'm aware
Hi,
of.
Darby.
Hi, Leslie. Thank you so much for this tonight. I'm so aware of the power of images, and so when I was looking at the images of the different kinds of storms, I imagined that being helpful to me when I feel that pain inside in certain places in my body, but to have an image of a storm that can coincide with it, because then the image can change. It's fluid, and it shifts and changes. So I appreciate that.
Thank you. Yeah. The power of image to go beyond what our words and our thoughts can do to move us clearly.
Leslie, thank you. Hi. You've given me so much to think about. I wasn't even sure how this was going to unfold for me. I mean, Yom HaShoah has a lot to do with my people, as they say. So you started with a general, and of course you went back to these more universal whirlwinds. But I also experienced the individual whirlwinds, and I didn't realize that I was living with so many, and I picked a really difficult one. And I've done nothing but write since you've been talking. I have found that writing has become a spiritual practice for me, and I'm so delighted that I have so much material from tonight to write about, because I'm just beginning with everything that you've asked us to consider and to write down. It just seemed to have flowed very naturally for me. And I think, in closing, that writing as a spiritual practice for me allows catharsis, but it allows growth and sharing. And I thank you very much for helping me recognize the whirlwind and its many forms and perceptions of the whirlwind and its many forms.
Thank you, Judith. And I probably ought to have said, if you have more than one whirlwind that comes up for you, why don't you pick a really little whirlwind? But you plunged right into the big whirlwind, so there you go.
I think I really need to look at it. And I also, excuse me for taking over here, but this is rather exciting for me. When you suggest, after you talk to us about, is this destruction or is it creation? When you ask us to look at other possibilities, then I can really embrace this catastrophe in my life, because obviously I've moved on from it. But I can really come to terms with it and accept it and realize that I've had a lot of life force from already, I didn't even know it, was beginning to take the creative energy rather than the destructive energy and move on.
Thank you. Well, remember the goddess Kali. She brings both destruction and creation. And Trisha's note in the chat was that writing as spiritual practice is something that she does daily, but she also helps lead people in that process in classes and workshops that she does. So that is something that is available. So I'll just check around and see if anyone else has anything to say this evening. And if not, then what I say is, be aware, remember the whirlwinds. Remember to change the lens every once in a while and not get steely-eyed and beady in one direction, that there are more perspectives if we just shift slightly. And to be able, in that way, we help anybody else around to realize that there might be another way to look at something. And I bless you all on the rest of the evening. Thank you so much for joining, and take good care of yourselves. Good night.